All right, so I'll just hand around a pass or a sign-in sheet. So first and last name on it, please. All right, so just looking ahead a bit, on Thursday, we'll talk exclusively about women in the Cold War era, both depictions of women, but also women in advertising agencies, things like that. Tuesday, of course, you're going to the archive. Candace will give you a presentation on how to find sources and whatnot. And also on Thursday, we'll look at sources and things like that, primary sources that will hopefully help you find your own sources, develop your own thesis statement, research questions, etc. So has everyone started thinking about their research topics? Everybody's sort of got a good leg up on it. Again, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about anything, I'm always here to help as much as I can in terms of helping you refine it, search for primary and secondary sources, all of that. So today we'll focus on the post-war society, the Affluent Society as it's called. It's also a very anxious time, so we'll sort of look at the yin and the yang of the 1950s era in American history, including advertisements, of course. So I'm sure if you've been conscious the past few years, you've heard this phrase, or make America great again. So what era do you think is probably being referred to when people say make America great again? It's almost never defined, but I think there is, some sort of inclination of what it's getting at. Does anyone? Go ahead.
I would say, well, typically right now today's period, you think back to Trump and he was president and his contracting, but if we're talking about history specifically, I'd say after the Depression and after World War II.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the Trump campaign is specifically like having a nostalgic look back at history as well, to this time period. So any sort of reason why the 1950s would be considered like a great moment in American history? Anyone? Yeah. So go ahead, Julie.
I think part of it is because we had a big role in ending the war, so we were kind of feeling like world power around the time.
Yeah.
We also had baseball and kind of spread American traditions around the world. So.
Yeah, and values. Yeah, good. Go ahead.
Strong middle class.
Yep, that's a big part of it. Anyone else? Yeah, so usually what's thought of when you think of this great moment in American history is there's very low unemployment in the 1950s, between 4 to 6%. There's a historic GDP growth through the 1950s. In 1950 alone, there's a GDP of 8.7% GDP growth. Here's the here.
No, you're good.
There's high rates of home ownership, usually backed by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, and the GI Bill. If you were a World War II veteran, you were almost assured of getting a government-backed home loan, usually very low rates compared to today. And there's the U.S. emerges from World War II as the preeminent world power, both economically, militarily, politically. The dollar overtakes the British pound as the most powerful currency. And of course, there's this notion of family values of the 1950s, in which you have the husband as the breadwinner. You have, at least in popular culture, the celebration of the stay-at-home wife and who's tending to sort of chores and cooking and looking after the kids who tend to go to good suburban schools. So again, all of this is sort of like a popular culture perception. It's much more complex than this, as we'll see as we go out through the lecture today. But this is usually what's being referred to when people look back nostalgically at the era of Donald Trump's childhood or the baby boom generation. So any reason, you guys know why the US emerged from World War II, particularly as the preeminent world power? Go ahead, Sammy.
Because most European economies were completely destroyed because the war happened in Europe.
Yeah, not just the economies, but the literal landscape of cities like London or Birmingham, Dresden, Berlin. I mean, St. Petersburg. These cities, were bombed heavily, which hurt their infrastructure, which hurt their economy. In the U.S., of course, the war didn't really happen on the North American continent, so the U.S. emerges as the preeminent world power. Plus, there's all these anti-colonialist movements happening after World War II, where like France is losing their empire, Great Britain's losing their empire, and they're sort of in retreat from imperial conquest. All right, so we've looked at this ad many times throughout the course of the semester. So remind me what the social tableau is regarding this ad. Anyone? Go ahead, Julian.
The American dream, also like progressivism maybe.
Okay, but what's particularly being sold? Like, look at the tagline. Go ahead.
It's selling like a happy suburban, typical, perfect family in the future after the war ends.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole ethos of it is that like this is a World War II era ad. So you're sacrificing during the war, and then after the war, you can get back to sort of like a 1920s level of consumer activity. So another way of thinking about it is that like finally the war has ended and the future is now. So this whole notion of the future being now is fueling this rampant consumerism of the 1950s. So why would there be this, ethos about the future being now, and like the past isn't so important and the future is not so important, now is the most important? Anyone? So think about how did Sammy, go ahead.
Well, first of all, why would you want to dwell on the last 20 years?
Yeah, that's a part of it. Depression and war, yeah.
Depression and war, obviously you want to move forward. And also, we spent the last however many years telling Americans about this utopian future, and now that nobody else is pretty much in the game, here it is. And I think also the government, if not the people, kind of knew we're only really going to have this monopoly for another, I think they probably predicted 20 years, and then it became 10, 15.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And there's this notion that like utopianism is being sold through consumer culture, but is it a utopian culture? And think about how did the war actually end? Go ahead, Chief.
With the bombing of Japan, the nuclear bomb.
Yeah, exactly. So the atomic bomb is dropped on Japan, which ends the war. And then, the Cold War, i.e. post-war era, is also known as the what age, the fill-in-the-blank age, the atomic age, right? So there's this notion of utopianism being sold to you, but it's really sort of like a very dystopian moment in history in which like there's mutually assured destruction, to whereas like the Russians bomb us, we automatically bomb them with nuclear weapons, and both societies, like world civilization, is essentially destroyed with the push of a button. So that's part of the reason this utopianism, this now is all that matters, is being so propagated throughout popular cultures, because there's a very real possibility that in the context of this actually dystopian society, that everything could be destroyed in a moment's notice. So I told you when we went through the progressive era that the one word that I wanted you to associate with progressivism was paradox. The one word that I want you to associate with the post-war era is dynamic. It's a really dynamic era in both good ways and bad ways. Thanks. So of course, this is the era of the baby boom. You can see from the stats here from 1946 to 1960, there really is like an off the charts proliferation of what I guess most of you now call the boomer generation, the baby boomers. And of course, this is creating tons of new consumers. Part of the reason there's such a baby boom, it's not just sort of like the sexual, habits of people coming back from the war and things like that. Also, there's huge advancements in the realm of medicine. Jonas Salk perfects the polio vaccine, so rates of infant mortality go way down or up. I guess the best way of saying is that there's a lot more healthy babies being born. During World War II, there's penicillin becomes really perfected, so that's also essential towards creating healthier children, children that live past the age of 3 or so. So this sociologist, John Kenneth Galbraith, he was a Harvard professor at the time. He writes this influential bestseller called The Affluent Society. In some ways, it's celebratory of this American consumer affluence, but in some ways, it's critical of it as well. You can see how I put the asterisk next to Affluent Society. Galbraith's conclusion is that the U.S. economy, based on a hedonistic consumption of products, would inevitably lead to economic inequality as the private sector enriched itself at the expense of the American public. And of course, central to this affluent society is the rise of American consumer culture. You had sort of a flowering of consumer culture all through the early decades of the 20th century, but in the 1950s, it becomes gospel of sorts. So just to remind you, FDR and the New Deal argued that government was best suited to address the needs and wants of the polity and sought to connect political activism with democracy. But Edward Bernays and the National Association of Manufacturers sought to counter this Keynesian notion of economic development. They sought to undermine the New Deal, concomitant to portraying big business and consumerism as the cornerstone of American democracy. The NAM, National Association of Manufacturers, championed the idea that passive consumers were essential in a big democracy such as the US, and that passive and satiated consumers meant stability and growth. So what you have flowering in the 1950s is what's referred to as the people's capitalism. You have this like leftward shift in American politics to a rightward shift, a more sort of conservative ethos, including amongst labor unions. The AFL and Congress of Industrial Organizations, they merged to create one super union. But by 1960, less workers are involved in unions, which diminishes the power of the AFL-CIO. So even though blue-collar unionized workers didn't gain any real control of the workplace during the prosperity of the 50s, they did benefit materially through steady pay increases and significant expansions of job benefits, such as medical insurance, paid vacations, and retirement benefits. Big corporations such as GE and GM provided these benefits in exchange for agreements like the Treaty of Detroit, which was passed in 1955 when the United Auto Workers agreed to take labor radicalism off the table if the company expanded the benefits package. So what you see is the labor unions starting to take more of a consumerist perception of themselves. So rather than defining themselves as factory workers, auto workers, whatever the case may be, they were thinking of themselves in terms of a consumer market. So there's two economists that really invert this Keynesian ethos of economics that was so prominent during the 1930s, Frederick Von Hayek and Milton Friedman. They both argue really staunchly that free markets are the best way for economic growth. So what you saw throughout the course of this class is that there's this movement away from Adam Smith's notion of economic development to Keynesianism, now back to this Adam Smith notion of laissez-faire free markets. So again, this is an affluent but a very anxious time in American history. And for many elderly, minority, and rural Americans, the affluent society remained out of reach. So just some stats on the rise of the consumer nation of the 1950s. More money was spent on advertising than on public education, which gives you a sense of how central consumerism is becoming to American society. Newly available credit cards, including the Diners Club, American Express, Sears card, made it easier for Americans to purchase and enjoy advertised products. So you might recall that in the 1920s, car companies were giving out lines of credit so that people could buy cars on credit, or people were buying stocks on credit a lot of times. That sort of comes to full maturation during the 1950s when basically anyone can get credit cards. So for the first time in American history, political leaders, economists, and foreign policy experts recognized that consumption, not production, was the single most important contributor to America's economic health. So a good microcosm of how central this ethos of consumerism is becoming. In 1959, Khrushchev here, the Soviet premier, and Vice President Nixon at the time was Eisenhower's vice president. There's this thing called the American National Exhibition, which is held in Moscow, where the Americans try to show the Russians all the great, the things that make America great, and the Russians conversely try to show through film, music, things like that, what makes the Soviet Union great as a sort of like, cultural exchange, a sort of like thawing detent of the tension that existed between them. But they have this debate about, what's good about America, what's good about the Soviet Union in a kitchen surrounded by all the latest sort of like appliances. And this was, set up by the Americans to show like how easy our housewives have it compared to women in Russia who tend to work in factories, things like that. They're not stay-at-home moms usually. Coke also goes global, as do many other American corporations in what we call soft power. So rather than sort of like sending weapon systems to other countries, we're sending what's called gun or butter rather than guns. So Coke in this instance. Coke had 60 bottling plants in 6 continents by 1950. And this ad here from circa 1950 sort of shows you how Coke was trying to champion its breadth throughout the world in different sort of cultures. And this one shows you the Coke's in Iceland. This one that Coke is, again, you have that like soft power ethos. This would have been before Mao's revolution in China, sort of trying to champion the US in China as like good friends, sharing Cokes with each other. So television becomes the preeminent like cultural force in American society. People are going to less and less movies. They're staying at home watching television. Ads go from print. I mean, they're still very important in print, magazines, newspapers, things like that. Billboards still sort of important, but by far the most prominent advertising medium is television. This guy, Philo Farnsworth, invents TV in 1928, but it doesn't really become commercially available until soon after World War II. So television became second only to the car as the most important appliance of affluence. In 1953, 2/3 of American households had television, but by 1960, 94% owned sets. And by the 1960s, Americans spent nearly as much time on average watching TV as working, which again gives you the sense that Americans' identities are more and more being transformed into like the job they perform during the course of the day, whether a factory worker, doctor, lawyer, whatever, into your consumer identity, what you're able to purchase, such as cars, TVs, etc. So you see an ad for Motorola. Again, like during this time period when TV's new, there was a lot of parents who were afraid that this would rot their kids' brains or that they would become obsessed with their like zombie-like and ignore their chores, etc. So this Motorola ad is not just selling you the Motorola TV, but explaining to you how the TV can be educative and is good for your family, good for your children. You get a sense of the family gathered around watching like a soap opera or something like that. Sort of selling you not just the television, but family time, family values. You see this image of nuclear family. So what's the wife doing, of course, in this ad? Yeah, exactly. So she's like in her domestic role while the husband sits in his slippers smoking his pipe with the kids. The wife is sort of on duty as still. You get a sense of how Christmas is becoming more commercialized, more commodified during the 20th century. So this Motorola ad is essentially not just selling you the television, but selling you it as a Christmas present that you can open. Your family would be excited. You can see the kids watching Santa Claus on television. During this time period, corporations tend to sponsor these televisions. So the Milton Berle show in this regard was sponsored by Texaco. This is the Texaco Star Theater. And there would be all kinds of product placements intertwined into the story. So that you would be talking about how great Texaco is, how great a company it is, how easy it is to find gas stations where you can fill up your new car or whatever. I Love Lucy was sponsored by Philip and Morris. So again, her and Desi would be smoking cigarettes throughout the course of the show, talking about like, wow, this Philip Morris sure is smooth, like how happy they are. Dragnet was sponsored by Chesterfield. Again, like there would be product placements throughout the show where they would be smoking the Chesterfields, talking about how tasty they were or whatever. The Goodyear tire company sponsored this TV Playhouse. So they would have kids talking about like how their dad just got new tires and how safe they made it feel, things like that. The Howdy Doody show was sponsored by Welch's Grape Juice. And in the back here, you can see the peanut gallery, as they were called. They would sing songs about how they looked forward to, Welch's juice after school and things like that. So in the 1950s, this is long before the proliferation of cable television. So you basically just have three national TV stations, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and they essentially dominate the airwaves. And then TV advertising, of course, became the most powerful force in the consumer economy through buying up ad space on these three channels. So Westerns, by far, the most popular genre of television in the 1950s. They focused on kids and teens and came with strong dose of social values, values in parentheses. So in 1959, Westerns accounted for 17.5 hours of prime time network television during the course of a week. So Hopalong Cassidy was very popular. And again, like there would be all kinds of new products that were spawned out of the popularity of these shows. So this would be, the lunchbox, the thermos that would come with it. And of course, this is its own form of advertising as well. The Lone Ranger and Tonto was very popular. Gina Autry's show, incredibly popular. Cisco Kid, Roy Rogers, and of course, this is Tyrone Power selling you cigarettes, but also his own brand, so to speak. And this Western sort of pastiche or ethos shows up in all kinds of different products, like Levi's, for example, or selling sort of the whole ethos of the Western frontier as a means of selling you their jeans. Toy guns become very popular during this time period. Kids are watching cowboys, throughout the week and then want to emulate them. So I'll show you this television commercial for toy guns that, this would have been the type of ad that you would see as you were watching the Gene Autry show or whatever the case may be.
You've just seen a demonstration of the most authentic Western toy cap guns in the world. They're from Mattel. You can get any of Mattel's rifles or pistols separately or in sets. The Sundowner set, the Frontier set, the Buffalo Hunter set. All carry the rugged stamp of the Old West. You can tell they're Mattel. They're swell.
All right, so Westerns were so popular in American culture and they became so associated with American culture and values that behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviets started making what were called red Westerns or Osterns, Easterns, where they inverted this notion of the sort of lone cowboy out on the frontier by himself, settling the frontier and opening it for, capitalist exploitation or whatever the case may be. So the American cowboy was, of course, emblematic of rugged individualism, conquering and taming the wilderness, westward expansion, manifest destiny, i.e. imperialism. So red Westerns portrayed cowboys as the bad guy, i.e. the imperialist, and communal living Native Americans as victimized, heroic good guys. There was this guy, a Yugoslavian, who became really popular, like the John Wayne of these Osterns. And he became a huge celebrity, but why would that be contrary to what you would think of as the communist system? Anyone? Go ahead, Sam.
The idea of a Soviet celebrity, inherently contradictory.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of like how we looked at with the sort of ads selling women modernity in the 1920s, how they were actually sort of paradoxical in the sense that they're selling you modernity, but conservatism at the same time. These Soviet red Westerns were selling you the notion of capitalism being the bad guys, meanwhile creating a capitalist system through these Osterns. All right, so by 1958, US networks sold $15 million worth of American programming to other nations. So again, this is that soft power that's being exported. By the early 1960s, ABC alone owned a stake in 54 different stations in 24 nations. So here's an example of Yowdy Doody. So it's basically the Howdy Doody show that made for a Cuban audience. This is before the Cuban Revolution, obviously. But this would be a popular show to watch amongst Cuban kids. So Reagan also becomes incredibly popular in the 1950s. He was sort of a B-list movie actor in the 40s. But he really comes to the center of American collective consciousness in the 50s. He's a pitchman for GE, which is the fourth largest company at the time. So I'll just show you Reagan pitching GE.
That was Act One of The Fenton Touch, starring Jack Benny. Now for special news about General Electric's new 1958 filter flow washer. This is the wonderful filter flow washing system introduced and perfected by General Electric
to give clean, bright washes with no lint fuzz. Lint is caulked for good here in this easy-to-reach, easy-to-clean, non-clogging filter. No more linty socks like these. Instead, clean and bright with no lint fuzz. And with this new 1958 General Electric, you get filter flow washing plus wash-to-order fabric keys. You simply touch one key to give your wash load the just right combination of wash and spin speeds and water temperatures. There's a clearly marked key for all your washables, cottons, synthetics, and specials. Results, everything clean and sparkling with no lint fuzz. See this big capacity 1958 General Electric filter flow washer and matching dryer at your General Electric dealers.
Yes, that commercial gives you a sense of the ubiquity of household appliances, these labor-saving devices that are becoming so popular amongst the middle class in particular. But it also gives you a sense of Reagan coming into your home and you developing a relationship with him. A lot of people couldn't understand how Reagan could appeal to, Carter voters or LBJ voters when he ran for president in 1980. But the reality of the situation was that people had grown up with Ronald Reagan. They had developed a relationship with him via watching him on television throughout the years. So this debate between Nixon and JFK, which happened in the lead up to the November 1960 election, underscores the importance of television to politics. Nixon was the vice president for Eisenhower, which was an incredibly successful political administration. The US, as we noted, unemployment was very low, the GDP was very high. And nobody really thought Kennedy had a chance of besting Nixon until they had this televised debate in which Kennedy looks cool, calm, collected. Nixon looks, sweaty and disheveled. And this really, in a very close election, sort of like a lot of, pundits think made the difference, is that Kennedy just seemed like he was, more apt, more up to the job than Nixon. So again, as all of these American television shows and networks are making footholds into markets around the world, ad agencies like the Thomson Agency is also setting up shop in places like Madrid, Paris, Tokyo, and really exploiting these new TV markets to sell American products via these new TV stations. So the 50s is also known as an era of automania. The car, as I said, other than household ownership, becomes central to American consumer identity, consumer culture. So in 1955, the US produced 2/3 of the world's supply of autos. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler accounted for 94% of American automobile output. So again, this is the rise of the space age. Nike comes into being. Sputnik is launched in 1957. So this is sort of the onset of the space age, and you start to see this fetish for the space age showing up in the manufacturing of cars. So I'll show you just a quick video on that as well.
By the 1950s, it was not unusual for families to have more than one car. The concept of the husband going off to work in the morning and the wife staying home dutifully with the kids was really beginning to change. People began thinking that the car isn't just utilitarian transportation. It should be fun. It's an escape. What was the most modern thing? Well, jet aircraft, certainly. Rockets. People like Harley Earl at General Motors were looking at these trends and saying, okay, the car of tomorrow is going to be like an airplane for the road. The Firebird is a perfect example. Here's an automobile that looks for all the world like a jet plane without wings. In fact, it has these little vestigial wings so that it wouldn't take off. It was an idea car. It was a laboratory on wheels. The Motoramas, which came to cities all around the country, showed you the car of tomorrow and offered you the car of today. The dream cars, like our Buick Centurion, said, okay, here's the Buick of tomorrow. And by the way, we'd love to sell you today's Buick. These dream cars were a great way to get people in, get them excited. And I think to some degree, people were feeling, I've got some of that dream car in the car that I have. And many times the features of these dream cars found their way into production cars. Harley Earl and Alfred Sloan. Alfred Sloan ran General Motors. Harley Earl was his prophet of style. They developed the concept of planned obsolescence. it was easy enough to say, okay, we have to cut new tooling anyway, let's change the fenders. The cars were different each year, which meant that keeping up with the Joneses, looking next door and saying, oh, they've got the new 57 Chevy, it makes our 55 look sort of dowdy. Maybe we should get the new 58, which looked totally different. In the 50s, the notion was you traded your car every 2 to 3 years. You wanted the latest.
Yes, the two takeaways from that are keeping up with the Joneses and planned obsolescence is feeling it. So this ad for Chrysler does a good job of showing you how these cars that are being marketed are, you know, based on this sort of like new aviation technology, trying to sort of give you the notion that these cars are as fast as jets. Go ahead, Sam.
I noticed just in the last 10 minutes that there is this heavy emphasis placed upon naming the year in your products. Because here with the cars, which I guess we still kind of do, but also with the washing machine, which Reagan was telling us, he was like 1958, not the 1957. You can't be singing that. But we're now we don't call it the iPhone 2020, which we give it some, you know, whatever number it is in that line.
Yeah.
Which is like kind of specific to the individual product. But here it was less about like the individual brand, the individual product, and more about how it was on the, you know, on the global or national stage, so it got labeled in a year.
Yeah, I mean, but whether it's the 57 Chevy or the Apple 13 or the iPhone 13, it's all like selling you new and improved, right? It's always like planned obsolescence. So you can see just how different the cars went from this 1956 ad to from the 1908 Ford Model T. It's like a completely different species, so to speak. So during the 1950s, auto production increased to 8 million units annually, and by 1960, there were more than 70 million cars on the road. In 1955, GM became the first US company to make more than $1 billion in a single year. By 1960, it had become the world's largest corporation, surpassing in the gross national product of many nations. So one of the things that's making all these cars ubiquitous in all these different styles is that during World War II production line, like assembly lines, the technology of those was heightened so much that you could really just pump out cars in like a minute or so. So it's just sort of like flooding the market with these cars and then selling them to the public. So as that video that we just watched also points out, Alfred P. Sloan is essential to this notion of planned obsolescence. It's called Sloanism. Sloan's philosophy was to use extensive marketing and constant design changes to convince Americans to buy new cars, regardless of need, which is, of course, planned obsolescence. Sloan created a ladder of consumption with different levels of brands tailored to different income levels. Sloanism was so successful that the family car became the most important marker of American success among all classes during the 1950s. All right, so again, like the whole point of planned obsolescence is selling you new and improved, whether you need it or not. And you see this today, it's still very prominent in American consumer culture of things like Air Jordans, like every year. So there's, you know, a new and improved, sometimes retro. But there's also flexible accumulation that's invented during the 1950s. So say like one car would be built in 12 different places. Like say your windshield would be built in Akron, your tires would be from Toledo, your engine would be from, you know, Pontiac, Detroit, wherever. So why would flexible accumulation be so beneficial to business owners, such as Nike in this case? Part of it's from sourcing material, right? So say you get rubber in Liberia or Vietnam or wherever, you can have a plant there. But it's also beneficial to have your product built in many different places, because if one of your labor forces, say in Saigon or whatever, decides to go on strike, you can easily shut down that factory, open a new one somewhere else, and not really interrupt the distribution network. So it's just a way of giving capital like that much more leverage against labor. So where would this car, like in the ladder of consumption, Sloan's ladder of consumption, where would this car lie, do you think? Top or bottom?
At the top.
Yeah, exactly. So Cadillac is, you know, as I've said before, it's, you know, the preeminent symbol, at least in the 20th century, of having made it in, you know, American business or whatever. And you can see with these Cadillac ads, is sort of like imbuing of like royalty in it, where you have like a coat of arms at the top, sort of like crown jewels or something like that embedded in the ad. And again, like this is selling you a Cadillac, but what else is it selling?
Like a rich family.
Yeah, rich family, nuclear family. So you have sort of like the wife in her Dior dress, the two kids in their little suits, the happy big sister. So it's showing you the ethos of, you know, the nuclear family as well, white nuclear family. So where do you think Dodge would fall on the ladder of consumption? Just based on like what you see in the ad. Go ahead, Parker.
Probably a little lower than Cadillac, but like mid to high.
Yeah, I mean, what's conspicuously absent from this ad compared to the last ad? Go ahead.
Maybe it's the potential younger generation. They don't have a family. They seem to be maybe newlyweds or dating.
Yeah, exactly. So probably like a young couple who's just starting out might have his first job or like down at this sort of like lower chain of the corporate ladder or whatever. Yeah, good. So how about Ford? What do you think? Same thing with this ad. What do you read into this ad? Go ahead, Sam.
Super, just knowing what I know about Ford, super sort of middle class, not anything over the top fancy, but definitely nothing to be ashamed of. Like it's really solid everyday choice.
Yeah, good. Go ahead.
I feel like this ad, they're really focusing on like the details of the car. Like they have to sell you on what the ignition, the seats. Whereas the other ads, they were just the look, and you kind of know with the brand, like you Cadillac, and your Cadillac, you just know it's luxurious. They kind of have to sell you on the details of this car.
Yeah, so like selling you on the value of it, right? Like why this is a good value for it. Go ahead.
I was gonna say like almost the same points what she said, like the functionality of the car, like that you're gonna get a quality vehicle instead of just like a luxury thing for your neighbors to see.
Yeah, and exactly. Like, and again, like this, you know, lacks kids, so it's probably like a young couple just starting out in life. So people who would be much more conscious of value, people who haven't sort of reached the executive level of the corporate structure. So how about this one? Go ahead.
Oh, I would really want to know. Like second farm, like a farm, so that's car work.
Yeah, exactly. Most of the ads that we looked at, it's sort of like an urban, you know, viewpoint. This is much more of like a rural one. You have this guy actually like, you know, engaged in labor. So yeah, I would say like, you know, working class, maybe a step above that. All right. So how about this one? What can you read into it? Go ahead.
They're selling you like, I guess, like a smooth, quiet car because they're putting it in.
Yeah, how many cars? Yeah, go ahead.
Two.
Yeah.
One's for the, I guess, probably another one for the wife.
Yeah, so which one would be for the dad, do you think?
I think, is he not in it right there?
No, I think that's the wife, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that was the kid.
Yeah, so like the sports car would be for like the dad and who's like having to drive into the city likely and back out to the suburbs. What do you read into the house? Anything?
It's like more modern.
Yeah, exactly. So it has that like sort of like Frank Lloyd Wright type of like, you know, modern, sleek lines, which would indicate something about the class of these people as well. So, you know, probably upper middle class, able to afford a sports car. So again, these tail fins become very popular. It's like essential to point out obsolescence. Like a lot of times the engine wouldn't change at all, but they would just stick like a bigger fin on it. So like, you know, that would, you know, create like a new price point for it. But what do you see, like who's the consumer in these ads? Yeah, just exclusively women. So cars are increasingly designed to appeal towards women since they spend most of the time like ferrying the kids around, shopping, things like that. And again, the whole ethos of the 1950s is, you know, two cars per family becomes sort of like standard operating procedure. So a husband drives into the city and then back to the suburbs. The wife would have, you know, maybe these station wagons where she could pick up groceries, pick up the kids, maybe have the dog in the back, etc. So we looked at VW on Thursday, their ads. Well, how was VW trying to market itself? Do you remember? Go ahead.
Like compact and versatile.
Yeah, in contrast to like who?
Like just boat cars and big cars.
Yeah, exactly. So remember when VW tries to enter the US market, they have a real branding problem because at the time, these big sort of like tail fin laden cars are the ethos of American, that's what's popular. So VW has to come into the market and compete with that. So it very shrewdly, remember Birnbach was the one who came up with the VW campaign. It has to, market itself as the anti-Cadillac, so to speak, or the anti-Ford. So essentially what's being sold in this ad other than the Volkswagen? Yeah, Joey.
Consistency, reliability, I guess.
Yeah, that's part of that.
They're like a timeless design. They're like confident what they made in 49, they still are in 63.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, it's basically saying that, you buy this car and you keep it for a long time. It's the antithesis of planned obsolescence, where like you're buying the car because, you want to buy the car, and it's a good car. And remember, this is sort of the rise of the beat generation in the 1950s, the rise of the counterculture through the 1960s. And that's the audience they're trying to capture, not this like conformist, staid IBM employee or GE employee, but the sort of kid who wants to go backpacking across the country or whatever. So all of this is sort of fueled along by in 1956, the Federal Highway Administration creates this whole network of highway systems of connecting all of these divergent markets into one holistic nation state in a way that hadn't existed before. And then this car craze is fueling the rise of all kinds of other businesses too, like McDonald's, the Golden Arches, which is one of the most iconic symbols of branding in the United States. They almost always advertise with a car in the picture. They're one of the first restaurants to have drive-throughs. You can see the Golden Arches and like all of their price points for things. This, you can see the 1950s era cars with their fins and all that, the Golden Arches. And of course, drive-in theaters become very popular as well. I'm not sure how many more drive-in theaters there are across the country, but in the 50s, they were quite popular pastime. Of course, mobile leisure becomes very popular. Chevy comes out with this whole ad campaign, See the USA and Chevrolet, trying to get people to sort of travel these new highways and byways to national parks, different cities. There's a tourism boom. All of these chain motels start to pop up, like Holiday Inn, Ramada, things like that don't exist before. It's like the car is fueling like all of these new enterprises. So, if you're on the highway, you're passing an exit, you see all of these strip malls. These didn't exist until the 50s, essentially. National parks, you might recall in the 1930s, are being turned into tourist destinations by the CCC. But a lot of these parks are segregated, racially segregated, especially if they're below the Mason-Dixon line. So it gives you a sense of who is actually able to participate fully as an American in this like new corporatist consumer culture. And not everyone has the same access to it. During World War II, there's all kinds of advancements in aviation technology. FDR creates all kinds of relationships with royal families, like the House of Saud, for instance. So gas becomes much cheaper. So air travel becomes much safer and cheaper. So you have corporations like TWA. In this ad, they're showing you all of the destination hubs in the US and where it can take you, including Saudi Arabia, all kinds of different destinations in Europe. Of course, Chevrolet wants you to see the USA in your car, but Braniff Airways, what kinds of different airways are also trying to sell you that same ethos, but by air travel. So this stands for Chicago. Paris becomes a particularly popular destination for Americans. A lot of American soldiers had been through Paris during their wartime experience, and then they take their wives back to sort of see what the city's like, things like that. Mallorca becomes a popular tourist destination. All of Spain, really, Madrid, Barcelona. Spain, of course, is a fascist nation from the 1930s to 1975 when Franco dies, but the US brokers a deal with Franco to build an air base in Spain, which opens Spain to American tourism in particular. So behind all of this car craze, this mobile leisure movement is oil culture. So this is Huntington Beach here, just outside Los Angeles. You can see these people just enjoying their day at the beach, but also all of these oil derricks in the back. So we usually tend to think of oil as fueling cars and jets, But really just look around this room, like what all is made of plastic in here? Just about everything, right? And so like plastics are derived from oil. So it's not just, oil, like gas, things like that are driving this oil culture. It's all of the new products, these modern products that are made of plastic as well. It's just your computers, your desks, just about everything, top of this coffee cup. So in 1967, of the nation's 10 largest corporations, whether car companies or oil producers, and more products through the 1950s were made of plastics, which are derived from oil, and that hasn't really ceased to exist. It's happening more and more. You might see straws that are made out of like vegetable material now, but for the most part, everything's still made out of plastic. Tobacco companies become really ubiquitous in terms of advertising in the 1950s. Everyone knows by the 1950s that cigarettes are really bad for you, tobacco is really bad for you. People are getting cancer, people's teeth are falling out, etc. So in reaction to that bad news coming out about tobacco, the tobacco companies try to really sort of like flood the zone, so to speak, with new ads, trying to capture the popular crazes associated with the outdoor craze, the travel craze. So this, like some guy going fishing, enjoying his camel. This guy's going hunting, I suppose, enjoying his Kent. Skiing becomes very popular in the 1950s. This is trying to capture the skiing craze in places like Killington, Vermont, the Rockies, etc. These people sort of like taking a break from the smokes to have a cigarette. John Wayne, of course, the quintessential symbol of American masculinity, selling you camels. Reagan, here he is trying to sell you cigarettes for Christmas. Reagan again. And then you also have these strange ads where like babies are and small children are being put into cigarette ads. So like you can read up here, it says, before you scold me, Mom, maybe you'd better light up a Marlboro. So like essentially what's the baby saying to Mom? Yeah, exactly. So before you get mad at me for crying, like chill out with a cigarette. And then of course the right ad over here is, gee, Dad, you always get the best of everything, which captures that that keeping up with the Joneses, consumer ethos of the era, including Marlboro's being the best guy.
This is funny because my great grandmother told me that she was told by her doctor to smoke while she was pregnant because it would calm her down. Like wow. The medical advancements are insane now.
We heard not to be.
Yeah, talking about like abandoning your Hippocratic oath. With shared responsibility. But you can see in this ad too, there's, this whole post-war ethos of the boys coming home from the war and like this whole like hero culture surrounding the military, which we'll get into a bit next week, with the sort of rise of the Sun Belt, military industrial complex, all that. But this is sort of like the service pin and the dad's like smoking a cigarette like a foot away from his kid's head. And sort of like, the kid's like looking up to him like a hero, but of course this dad's sort of failing his shared responsibility to his job. Yeah, I mean, we definitely do. There's no question about that. Yeah, and I'll show you guys a book on Thursday as a means of maybe helping you get inspired for your favorite topic, but it's about that very topic. So we've been through from the 1920s to 1964 when the Surgeon General releases its report on, concluding that cigarettes can be cancer. But I'll show you this television ad for Camels in which a doctor is telling you how great Camels are for you.
If you were to follow a busy doctor as he makes his daily round of calls, you would find yourself having a mighty busy time keeping up with him. Time out for many men of medicine usually means just long enough to enjoy a cigarette. And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, they're particular about the brand they choose. In a repeated national survey, doctors in all branches of medicine, doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" Once again, the brand named most was Camel. Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days? And see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment. See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
And of course, like after, the Surgeon General makes it so that you can't have these type of ads where like doctors are selling you like cancerous products anymore. Like, anyone know how Camel responded to that? Like what their new advertising campaign was? Yeah, go ahead, Gene.
Toward kids.
Yeah, Joe Camel, right? This cartoon, like sort of like, the kids in particular would be sort of drawn to, right? So this is, we've looked at sort of the affluent society and the economic boom and all that, but there's also sort of like a dark, seedy side to this as well. So has anyone recognized this guy here? It's Leonardo Dicaprio. Anyone seen the movie Revolution Road?
Yes.
It's very depressing, isn't it? It's a solid movie. It's by the guy who did American Beauty, and he also responsible for Mad Men as well. But
DiCaprio doesn't act for depressive films.
Yeah. But Sam Mendes directed it. I think it's worth checking out if you're interested in sort of like complicating your perception of like this "Make America Great" ethos of the 1950s. So there's this whole notion that this conformity of the 1950s is really soul-stealing. And this isn't sort of like a liberal view or a conservative view. It's sort of pervasive. Like T.S. Eliot tends to sort of have a fascist bent. Aldous Huxley tends to have a leftist bent. William F. Buckley is like considered the voice of conservative America during this time period. And they all, despite their disagreements on other matters, all sort of agree that this corporatist consumerism of the 1950s is bad for the country. And that magazine becomes popular in the 1950s and often lampoons this whole sort of like conformist consumerist ethos of the era. I think this ad sort of does a good job of summing up the, just strangeness of this era, where you have this sort of evoking the atomic age where you can buy a bomb shelter, which won't really do anything to save you from like nuclear fallout. But it's like a consumer product. So there's like this consumer capitalization on this whole anxiety associated with the atomic age, in which, again, the whole party could end in the push of a button. There's all of these consumers, or not consumers, but like rituals of sort of like, fear that take place, where, an alarm would go off during the course of the day and all the kids would have to duck and cover under their desks. I mean, I had to do this. I grew up like 90 miles away from Cuba in South Florida. So, I mean, even as recently as the 1980s, we were going through these type of drills, and like, it was just sort of a farce because you knew they wouldn't do anything to protect you if, a bomb hit your school. It's just sort of like a strange ritual to give you the illusion of control when really you don't have any control. Rates of depression amongst housewives skyrocket during the 1950s, despite all of this sort of affluence and consumerism and seemingly not have to worry about like, a job or a commute. Again, the rates of depression go way up. Rates of sort of like pharmaceutical barbiturate use, things like that go way up. This ad for Schlitz sort of, lampoons it, I think, to some degree, where it says, "Don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer." Old time religion has a big revival in the 1950s, this move away from secularism back to sort of the church, as it were, which is very much fueled by the notion that, like, again, this is the atomic age, the world can end any minute. I want to know where I'm going if the world does end. So Billy Graham becomes hugely popular. He starts giving sermons in this canvas cathedral outside of Los Angeles. He develops a huge following. He's often has televised sermons. He starts giving sermons to packed stadiums like Madison Square Garden, things like that. Norman Vincent Peale writes a book about how to influence people and win friends. It was hugely popular with Fred Trump, who made his son read it, and it really shaped Donald's view of sort of like how to, conduct business. It was a super popular book in the 1950s. So in 1950, membership in Protestant denominations increased by 4%. That's just in 1950 alone. On the Roman Catholic Church, it grew 2%, both of which are astounding stats. This trend accelerated throughout the decades as church membership increased from 58% of the population in 1950 to 63% in 1959. Evangelicals gained millions of converts during the 1950s, especially in the transient Southwest. And by 1959, Americans invested $935 million annually in new church construction, much of it in Los Angeles and rapidly growing Western cities. This trend has reversed significantly into the 21st century. Very few people still go to church regularly in the 20th century. And regardless of what your political affiliation is. Like, I don't consider myself particularly religious, but I think this sort of rollback of people going to church every Sunday has been really bad in a political context, because you used to go to church with, like, you know, Democrats and Republicans, and you could see eye to eye on things. Now it's like we live in two different Americas where we don't really communicate with each other unless we absolutely have to, which I think is bad for the polity as a whole. So you get this conflation of church, state, and capitalism also during the Cold War. In God We Trust is put on the dollar for the first time. And all of this is sort of a reaction to this notion that communism is godless. There's this whole, like, you know, notion that religion is the opiate of the masses. So America tries to counter this communist ethos by, you know, championing Christianity in particular. The dollar, as I said earlier, overtakes the British pound as the most popular currency in the world. So again, this is like an advertisement for the United States and Christianity going all around the world. It's sort of like associating God with the United States. During this time period, Protestants, evangelicals become much more politically engaged. That's not to say that if you were Protestant, you wouldn't go vote, but there's much more of a connection, a rise of Christian nationalism, where people are associating Americanism with Christianity. People are becoming sort of much more open about their religious beliefs in a way that didn't exist before the 1950s. There's this whole corporate order that exists too. Again, America is becoming much more of a, you know, conglomerated. Corporations are really sort of gaining more political power, more economic power. A company from just around here, just up the road, General Electric, becomes a really preeminent corporation in American society. Through expansion and consolidation, GE became the nation's fourth largest company in the 1950s. With 136 factories in 28 states, it was the nation's third largest employer. So again, GE sold just about everything, manufactured and sold just about everything. The whole sort of docks of New Jersey, Brooklyn, they would just be long GE manufacturing plants. So here's an ad for GE television, another GE television, light bulbs, jet engines. Again, they made everything. So out of this morass of this sort of corporatization of American industry, there's this organizational man which develops. At least scholars say they're organizational men. So in this picture, you see all of these IBM employers essentially dressed the same way, all looking the same way, having the same haircut. They sort of are emblematic of this conformity of the era. So this sort of is indicative of a great deal of anxiety that exists in America during the 1950s. In 1957, white-collar workers outnumbered blue-collar workers for the first time in American history. And for critics, these corporate strivers represented the apex of conformist society. Organizational men, as they were referred to in the 1950s, dressed in uniform suits, commuted on crowded trains or highways, and worked long hours on mind-numbing bureaucratic tasks. And to climb the company or corporate ladder, they were expected to move often and to conform without question to rigid corporate rules of behavior. So this, as I said, it creates a lot of anxiety, especially amongst academics and sociologists. You can see David Reisman on the cover of Time here, where you can see just a mass of businessmen down here, and then these guys in their business suits with like wind-ups, sort of like, you know, indicating that they're automatons or they've lost their autonomy, they're robotic, they're soulless, etc. And this was, you know, by the end of the decade was sort of a prominent notion of what happened to you if you were one of these organizational men. He has this book that's published in 1950, becomes a bestseller called The Lonely Crowd. He argues that widespread unhappiness amongst the men who compromised American corporate culture. He worried that Americans had lost what German sociologist Max Weber referred to as the Protestant work ethic, which was the moral drive to prosper through one's own individual hard work that had accounted for the greatness of America. Similar to that notion, William White Jr. comes out with a book called The Organizational Man in 1956. He argues that there was a great deal of anxiety among white-collar workers who were disengaged from their families and traditional structures by rigid corporate work lives and long commutes. White's book buttressed concerns on the part of religious leaders that increased affluence did not necessarily translate into universal happiness and social well-being. So again, like you have these housewives, their rates of depression are going up, but also the rates of depression amongst these organizational men are skyrocketing as well. Sloan Wilson comes out with a novel in 1955 called The Man in the Great Flannel Suit, which is similar in ethos to White and Reisman's books. He painted a disturbing picture of a mind-numbing and soul-stealing conformity in corporate America. His novel helped popularize concerns surrounding American ennui and the loss of spiritual meaning in the realm of a corporatist consumer society. So while all of this is happening, the organizational men's kids are becoming much more rebellious, or at least it seems that way. Rock and roll becomes very popular, obviously, during the 1950s. The beat movement comes to a head. So teens in the 1950s emerged as a distinct consumer group. In 1930, only 50% of Americans 14 to 17 attended high school, but by 1950, this number had climbed to 73%. By the 1950s, driving sales of records and fashion, teens were the most sought after market segment in American society. And by the 1960s, with an average income of $10 a week, teens contributed more than $10 billion to the US economy per year. So you get these types of magazines like 17 magazine, specifically geared towards selling kids consumer culture and consumer products like Elvis Presley records, things like that. Chuck Berry becomes a huge star, sort of the father of rock and roll. Fats Domino as well, Little Richard. And then Elvis, of course, becomes very popular by the end of the decade as well. Jerry Lee Lewis. There's this whole pop fanaticism that rises in the 50s in which rock and roll is fueling consumer culture and consumer culture is fueling the rock and roll craze as well. You get sort of like how people think of K-pop nowadays. It's what Elvis was back in the day.
Also, FM radio.
Yeah, exactly. So FM radio overtakes AM radio as well. So you have these movies that sort of like champion, or not champion, but depict this disaffected youth of these rebellious kids who are sort of like snubbing their nose at authority or whatever. These types of movies, of course, really worry parents and things like that. It's sort of like the punk rock before there was punk rock. So Marlon Brando stars in The Wild One. James Dean stars in Rebel Without a Cause. Glenn Ford in Blackboard Jungle. West Side Story, of course, Spielberg just came out with a redux of it, but this is the 1957 version. And they all have the similar theme of, disaffected youth, like anti-authority, anti-conformity. J.D. Salinger's book, Catcher in the Rye, same theme, this, disaffected youth searching for meaning in a sort of seemingly meaningless existence. Jack Kerouac writes this book, On the Road, which is published in 1957, in which he basically travels throughout the country searching for meaning wherever he can find it, in what seems to be a largely meaningless world. Williams S. Burroughs writes this book called Naked Lunch, continues that theme of anti-authoritarianism, anti-conformity. I'll play for you just a short part of Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which I think does a good job of summing up the sort of rejection of this corporate conformity of the 1950s that's starting to take root amongst the bees.
Down to the river. Moloch, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows. Moloch, whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovah's. Moloch, whose factories dream and croak in the fog. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone. Moloch, whose soul is electricity and banks. Moloch, whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen. Moloch, in whom I sit lonely. Moloch, in whom I dream angels. Crazy in Moloch, cocksucker in Moloch, black love and manless in Moloch. Moloch, who entered my soul early. Moloch, who frightened me out of my natural ecstasy. Moloch, whom I abandoned. Wake up in Moloch, light streaming out of the sky. Moloch, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries, blind capitals, demonic industries, spectral nations, invincible madhouses, granite cocks, monstrous bombs. They broke their backs lifting Moloch to heaven. pavements, trees, lifting the city to heaven, which exists and is everywhere about us. Dreams, adorations, illuminations, religions, the whole boatload of sensitive bullshit, breakthroughs, over the river, flips and crucifixions gone down the flood, highs, epiphanies, despairs, 10 years, animal screams and suicides, minds, new loves, mad generation, down the rocks of time, real holy laughter in the river. They saw it all, the wild eyes, the holy yells. They bade farewell. They jumped off the roof to solitude, waving, carrying flowers down to the river, into the street.
So is that James Franco? Is that his name?
Yes.
Yeah, he played Ginsburg in a movie called Hell that just came out a few years ago. So yeah, I think Ginsburg does a good job of summing up this the beach rejection of this corporatism, this conformity that's really taking root amongst the beat generation, which ultimately, is the flower bed that the consumer culture grows out of in the 1960s. So Hall spoke to a growing number of alienated dissenters in a society obsessed with materialism and communism. Robert Frank comes out with this book called The Americans, which I'll just show you some of his pictures from this book that I think gives pictures to this whole sort of notion of disaffectedness that is taking root during the 1950s. So here's the route that Frank went around. And he basically just traveled around taking pictures of things that he felt like summed up American society for him anyway. So this is the book, The Americans. You can see the foreword is the intro is written by Kerouac. So here's a picture from Wall Street. Here's a picture of a public restroom where someone's just getting a shoe shine. Here's that sort of Miami, still very much prominent in the 1950s, in which you would hire an African American woman to raise your kids essentially, or well-to-do white family. This I think is an interesting image of sort of the I think it ties back to that gun commercial that we saw. And this is sort of like, I think, a hunting picture of just this girl at a picnic smoking her cigarette. And again, all of these were meant to sort of like say something about America during the 1950s from at least through the lens of a beat photographer. So 3 things that I want you to take away from the beat generation are they celebrated nonconformity and experimentation in their lives. Beat literature, 1950s rock films, or films in rock and roll all revealed the diversity of American culture brewing beneath the conformity and consumerism of the decade. And by calling into question America's traditional values, 1950s nonconformists had taken the first steps towards a critical collaboration between alienated progressive whites and Black civil rights activists, which we'll get into a bit more as we go through the semester. All right, so just looking ahead to Thursday, again, we'll focus primarily on women of the 1950s, depictions of women in advertisements, what they mean or may not mean, but also women in the advertising industry. So be sure to read Savilka's The Fabulous 50s. We'll discuss that as well. Which is, of course, is in Moodle. And then remember Tuesday, you guys will be going to the archive to Candace will present to you how to best use the archives. So everyone's papers are coming along okay? All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Are we meeting in the archive or are we just like?
Yeah, we'll just meet at the archive. I'm pretty sure it's Methodist 118 if I remember correctly. But if anything changes, I'll send out. Anyone?
Across from the library.
Yeah, so
it's right across from the library. It's to the left of this building.
Yeah. All right. So that's all for today. I'll see you guys Thursday. Have a good,
Okay, I just put the others in the chat and that?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Yes, I'm about to done. Yeah, I got you. Let me check what you're saying. Yeah.
He's probably over, I guess, you know?
Yeah.
It's so annoying because
Yeah, I would say that like he's either the one taking the picture, that would be the indication, or he's, you know, in the city
if
doing
I don't
his
send it
job.
on
and,
my
like,
other
trying to
force
force
it, then it's hurt.
I don't know, I guess. Welcome back, man. It's good to see you.
I know, it's been a minute. Oh, I'm so cold.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you're good.
I was so hot.
No, I feel that. Yeah, I felt massively behind on everything.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, like, just,
I finished the midterm.
Okay, good.
Which I did send to you, but I don't know if you got it.
I don't know that you sent it to me. I didn't get anything.
Okay, if I can't figure out how to submit it on Moodle, can I email it to you directly?
Oh, we submitted it on Moodle. That's probably why. Yeah, just you probably did. I just didn't know because I haven't checked in a while. So
Okay.
yeah, I'll
I can also email you a copy.
Okay.
The other thing is that quotes ones I'm behind on most, the entries.
Okay.
That one I was fixing up the first one. I got partway through that. Didn't really get to the second one. It's been a challenging few weeks.
Yeah, I can imagine. Don't worry about it. I mean, whatever you need, I'm happy to accommodate as best as I can. Just sort of like keep me up to date on what else going on.
Yeah.
But again, as you know, like, you know, just get it to me whenever you can.
Yeah,
by the end of the semester.
Yeah, no, I'm keeping up with readings and stuff, and the history stuff. I'm pretty good with this. Especially like 40s to like 90s. Like it's my specialty.
Yeah, so things should get easier, especially with the more you know, ads become, you know, more multimedia, you know.
Yeah, because obviously television becomes a thing.
Internet, once we get to the 90s.
Radio is a big thing for Roosevelt, for instance, and fireside chats. Speaking of, I am going to Hyde Park in 2 weeks.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's awesome. I've always wanted to go.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this. I've wanted to go my whole life. He's
What are
probably
you
my favorite president.
Yeah, FDR, yeah.
Yeah. He's up there. I really like I like elements of Coolidge. I really like Eisenhower.
Eisenhower was like a real, like, honest, like, intellectual type, you know.
If
I
I
was
remember
being a military.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, he at the end of his presidency, in his farewell speech, he apologized and admitted he did something wrong, which is such a refreshing thing.
Yeah, he had a
it
real
was specifically.
His farewell address was really sobering. Like, he warns about like the military-industrial complex, and crass consumerism becoming central to American life. It will play.
I'll play a little. All Eisenhower, yeah.
I'll play a little bit of his farewell address on Thursday, next Thursday, because I think it's really.
His farewell address was amazing.
Yeah,
I really
want
wanted
the president of Colombia too. You know, he's a really impressive guy.
I really want an I like Ike pen. I really want one of those I like Ike pens.
Yeah. I wonder if you could find one on eBay. You know?
Yeah, I bet they're expensive.
I'm sure.
I'm sure they're like artifacts.
I'm sure.
All right, well, I'll keep you posted on the work.
All right, man, I appreciate it. Take care. And again, anything you need, just let me know, yeah? Oh, you're good.
It's amazing.
Okay. You're good. There you go.
See you Thursday.
All right, man, take care. Glad to have you back, yeah?
Yeah.